All right. Well, good afternoon. Today is March 28 at 12 p.m. We are connecting from Tower Center here at SMU. And we're going to start our program in Russia's relation with the European Union and mutual divorce. And to start, our director, our academic director, Jim Hollifield, is going to do the intro remarks. Thank you, Jim.
Yes, thank you, Astrid. Let me just take a moment to welcome everyone who's joining this webinar today on a topic that is of vital interest to all of us, especially in the United States. What has happened in Europe with the war between Ukraine and Russia has really turned things upside down and inside out. It has changed the whole security architecture in Europe. And we're really lucky today to have two great scholars who are going to join us and lead us through thinking about what has happened in Europe and what's going on, especially with the relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and the EU. I especially want to welcome the members of the Tower Center who are with us today. I think with our two scholars who are joining us, I don't know how many years between the two of you. Both of you have been studying Russia probably for almost a century, maybe, or maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. But my job is essentially to introduce my colleague, Dan Orlovsky, who's a professor of history here, one of the great scholars of modern Russia and of the Russian Revolution. And I'm delighted that Will Pomeranz from the Wilson Center is joining us today. I've been a fellow at the Wilson Center for almost 20 years, and we have a great working relationship with Will and the Wilson Center. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dan Orlovsky, who will introduce Will, and we'll get the program started.
And let me unmute you. Daniel, give me just 1 second.
Got it.
There we go. And just a quick, sorry, I forgot to mention, if you would like to make questions, please use the Q&A on the bottom of your screen. We're going to be reading the questions. Thank you.
And so again, it's an honor to welcome Will Pomeranz to the Tower Center, to this program. A very old friend, someone I've worked with for a long time in the areas of late imperial Russia, especially the Russian Revolution. He occupies a very important place in our profession as the director of the Kennan Institute in Washington, the leading institute these days of Soviet, Russian, post-Soviet, Eurasian, whatever we want to call it, studies. And he has a wonderful life history related to this, because he practiced international law in Moscow. He's trained as a lawyer as well as a historian. He has a Ph.D. in Russian history from the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, the University of London, and has written many, many works and has appeared almost daily over the last years on the major networks and outlets purveying his expertise. He may also tell you a little bit about how he was banned from travel to Russia by the current regime, but that's another story. His latest book is Law in the Russian State, Russia's Legal Evolution from Peter the Great to Vladimir Putin, a book that I highly recommend to anyone who wants to get a real handle on the legal aspects of 20th century Russian history. We're especially delighted today to bring you this program on Europe and Russia. I'm having trouble. Can you see me, all of you?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I have disappeared, but I'll get back to that in a minute. Usually we're talking about the war, we're talking about Ukraine and NATO. We emphasize the security structures, but today we're going to talk about Europe, Russia and Europe, Ukraine and Europe, the European Union, a slightly different focus. And I think that's very, very important. And just yesterday or last week, this massive tome, which I can barely lift up, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, was the topic in my seminar. And I had them read the section on the Napoleonic invasion, book 3, which I recommend to you all, as I do the Bondarchuk Soviet film, the 8-hour Soviet film from the 1960s. And it occurred to me in going back to this that this might have a lot to tell us about Russia and Europe, and about Russia's historical attitude toward Europe, and about Russian patriotism and Russian attitudes toward war and so on. And I was correct. I think it does. And that's why I recommend that you, our listeners, our participants, look at this wonderful volume when you can in your spare time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Will, who will give us some insight on Russia, Ukraine, and Europe, and the legal aspects of it. Will, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dan and Jim, and it is a pleasure to be speaking virtually to SMU. I'm just going to talk briefly about the Russia-EU breakup, but also deal with some of the political and economic aspects of that breakup. So, very quickly after Russia's invasion, Russia was expelled from the European Union. It was expelled the day before Russia decided that it no longer wanted to be a part of the European Union anyway. But that kind of was the initial break that occurred during the onslaught of this invasion. But it has had knockoff effects as well, in terms of what were the consequences for Russia in terms of leaving the European Union. There are many. Russia will no longer be subject to the European Human Rights Convention, and Russia will no longer be subject to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Now, it may be something that you haven't really thought about, but in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the 1993 Constitution was very receptive to international law. Article 15.4 stated that the universally recognized principles and norms of international law shall be a part of the Russian legal system. Now, I can assure you that the United States Constitution does not contain a similar clause. Indeed, the United States has always been very protective in terms of how it interacts and interprets international law. But nevertheless, as a result of this provision and Russia's decision to enter the European Union, those Russians who were dissatisfied with domestic decisions could apply to the European Court of Human Rights to have their situation otherwise adjudicated. And basically, tens of thousands of Russians from the 1990s on used this ability to appeal to European institutions and the European Court of Human Rights to address what they thought was an unfair decision in the Russian Federation, in domestic courts. So human rights litigation after Russia joined the European Union, human rights litigation became a part, really, of the Russian litigation process. And if you were dissatisfied with the, as I said, the decision in Russian courts, you could turn to the European Court of Human Rights. These decisions, the European Court also had an important impact on the development of Russian law, whether it be certain procedural issues, such as the right to re judicata, or essentially the finality of judgments. The European Court issued opinions on social rights, on human rights, on gender equality, and so forth. All of these decisions had an impact on Russian law. Indeed, Valery Zorkin, the longtime head of the Constitutional Court, mentioned in the early 2000s that the Russian Constitutional Court had basically adapted, or at least had cited European court decisions. And so in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the introduction of Russia to the European Court of Human Rights, there was a significant change in how Russian adjudication took place, and there was an international appeal that was a part of the Russian judicial system, essentially. So I think that is important to understand that with the beginning of this war, the attempt to actually make claims to the European Court has basically fallen apart. There have been other breaks with Europe as well. Russia has denounced the European Convention about Criminal Responsibility for Corruption. Russia has been expelled from the Venice Commission, which advises individual countries in Europe about constitutional matters and tries to improve democratic institutions and the protection of human rights. Russia has left other international organizations as well, including the Conference of European Constitutional Courts, the International Association of Prosecutors. Russia is still a member of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, but it recently announced that it's not going to be sending any information to the OSCE. So essentially, it will no longer be a part of that institution either. Basically, though, in terms of Russia's interactions with Europe, Russia has really become a pariah. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe recently declared that Russia was a sponsor of terrorism. European nations who are part of the Arctic Council have basically said that they will not attend any meetings of the Arctic Council, especially during the time period that Russia is head of the Arctic Council. So that institution essentially is moribund as well. Europe will pursue the issue of war crimes against Russia. And indeed, since the UN and Russia has a veto in the Security Council, can't really pursue these war crimes that have occurred during the war in Ukraine. The European Union has talked about creating a separate international tribunal under its auspices so that it could deal with the question of crimes against humanity and the crime of aggression. This is in addition to the recent arrest warrant that was issued by the International Criminal Court for Vladimir Putin for the unlawful deportation of children. So the decision to end the cooperation with Europe and to not be a part of the European the interactions with the European Union has had an important impact on the Russian Federation. The divorce has also had economic consequences as well. The EU, as well as the United States, has revoked the most favored nation trading status with Russia, which means they're subject to sanctions and other tariffs. The price caps that have been imposed on oil and gas by the EU has significantly decreased Russia's energy revenues. Russia, however, really believes that thinks it can go it alone and doesn't really need European trade. And Russia has introduced several policies that have aggravated this development, including its policy of import substitution, of substituting Russian products for Western goods, even if in many cases there aren't significant Russian products. And Russia is still relying on parallel imports, knockoffs of Western products that have been sent to Russia. Although again, the Europeans and the United States have raised this issue of parallel imports to the Russian Federation. And even Kazakhstan now has decided that it's going to have a more rigorous process of understanding what sorts of products are going into Russia, and will stop parallel imports at the border. So in terms of legal ramifications, economic ramifications, I think the divorce with the EU has been significant, and it has lasting ramifications for Russia. It will no longer, as I said, be a part of the European Court of Human Rights. Its ability to trade with Europe has significantly decreased, and the revenues that Russia used to get from the EU have also been significantly diminished. So where is Russia going? I think the hope at the end of the collapse, at the end of the Soviet Union, was that Russia would integrate into the global economy. Indeed, I argued that in fact, that was really the only thing that the West decided to do. They did not have a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, for Russia. They did not say they were going to bail out Russian industry, mainly because they didn't understand it. So what the only promise that the West made, primarily to Russia, was that it would allow Russia slowly to integrate into global institutions and the global economy. Unfortunately, with this war, Russia now has abandoned this process of integration and has turned inward. It has emphasized Russian statehood, that Russia is its own civilization and has its own special path, and that therefore Russia doesn't have to follow the economic advice or integrate into the global economy. There has also been legislation that has enforced and talked about the purity of the Russian language. And there has also been laws against the spies and any critic of the war. So essentially, in the aftermath of abandoning Europe and abandoning these principles, Russia has basically turned back to an autocratic and one could argue totalitarian system. Putin has also returned to a more historical goal. And I think that what he has demonstrated during this war is that he wants basically to add to Russian territory in an imperial fashion. Indeed, this war has emphasized that Russia is pursuing an imperial agenda because it is attempting to increase and add land and territory to the Russian Federation. And we've seen that in the legislation on some of the republics in some of the regions in Ukraine that have been annexed, including Donetsk and Luhansk. But the annexations have also included Kherson and Zaporizhia, even though Russia has not been in control of the city of Kherson. But Russia has now embraced an imperial path. And basically, it has decided, and Putin has decided, that the only way for him to be remembered in Russian history and to have a legacy of a great Russian leader is to add territory to the Russian Federation. So when this war started, it was anticipated that Europe was the weak link in this battle, and that Putin, through his basically use of raw materials and energy resources, could divide and conquer Europe, and they would not continue and be a strong participant in the defense of Ukraine. But I'll close by saying that Europeans also understand empire, since all of the major European countries were empires at one point. And they know very well what happens when borders are not respected and upheld. So with that, I'll open the floor to Dan's questions and conversation.
Okay, so are you going to go through the chat questions, Esther?
Yes, of course. I don't know if you have a initial question for William. I can go through the questions. We have Andrew Strickland. How can the United States push Russian influence out of the European Union, especially Germany, since we have seen the European Union take the convenience of Russian energy after the fall of the Soviet Union? The thinking that Russia can change again. How do we stop this cycle from happening again after the fall of Vladimir Putin? That was Andrew Strickland.
So I think what will happen if Vladimir Putin falls, and I think that there is a strong possibility that will happen. I think that what is important is that Russia will not be invited back, as it were, to these European institutions. When the decision was made to allow Russia to join the European Court of Human Rights and so forth, it was very well recognized that they really didn't have the infrastructure to be a member of Europe and to enforce the European Court of Human Rights. But it was decided that it was more important to have Russia be at the, as it were, at the bottom looking up, as opposed to the outside looking in. And that was the rationale for inviting Russia and into engaging with Russia during the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think that Russia will not have such a similar welcome, even if they depose Vladimir Putin, even if they talk about reforms. I think it will be much harder for Russia to go and approach Europe in the aftermath of this war. And I also think that even if Vladimir Putin were to leave the scene tomorrow, that would not end this conflict, in the sense that there will be a reckoning for Russia and the crimes that it has committed in Ukraine, no matter who stays in charge. And I think this element of accountability is an important part of any post-war scenario. And I think the Europeans have been particularly forceful in saying that it will try to even have new institutions that will hold Russia accountable for its war crimes in Ukraine.
Thank you, Will. All right, we have Blake Weaver. We consistently hear about the sanctions and restrictions placed on Russia. How effective are these actions? Are we starting to see the effects on their economy?
I will begin by saying I am not an economist, but I have been following some of the shortages and problems with the Russian economy since since sanctions have been introduced. And so at the present time, Russia doesn't have enough medicine. Russia doesn't have enough high-tech chips in order to build new weapons and so forth. Russia's exports of military weapons, especially to India, have dramatically declined. I think that and finally the issue of a significant budget shortfall now. When Russia was selling oil and gas to Europe, they had a rainy day fund and a big surplus, but that surplus has disappeared. And Putin basically has called on Russian business to kind of fill in the difference. And even Russian businessmen, who are, for the most part, dependent on Putin and Putin's stay in power, they are very reluctant to simply give their money back to the Russian state. So I think that sanctions have had an impact. Clearly, they haven't convinced Russia to get out of the war, but I think the economic impact is now noticeable and will only increase over time.
Thank you, Will. We have Jim Hollyfield asking, are OSCE and the Helsinki Accords really a dead letter? What is the status of Ukraine and post-Soviet successors state in the OSCE and Helsinki Accords?
So my understanding is that Ukraine is still fulfilling the international requirements. And I think that in a broader sense, that obviously Ukraine's transformation depends on being a part of the EU and fulfilling the demands that the EU will impose in order to have Ukraine become a part of the EU. So I think that in terms of economic reform, education, rule of law, and so forth, the EU will have a significant impact going forward, because to become a part of the EU, I heard today that Ukraine will have to repeal thousands of pieces of legislation just so that they can abide by the EU regulations. So the EU will be a tremendous catalyst for legal reform in a way that the United States cannot. So I think that Ukraine is anxious to be part of the EU. It will fulfill whatever obligations it has under the EU. And in the long term, I think there is a better chance for Ukraine to become a part of the European Union than a part of NATO. I think the NATO negotiations will be much harder to actually have Ukraine, which is in a serious conflict, be a part of NATO.
Do you think that that kind of compromise would be likely in negotiation, that they would settle for EU membership?
I think at the present time, Zelensky wants everything, EU membership and NATO, and he wants all the territories back. And there is a question of whether and how, when those territories would be given back, whether, Russia would give up Crimea, for example. So I think Zelensky has basically put forward his demands. And I think in light of the sacrifice of the Ukrainian people and the significant damages that have been incurred on Ukraine, that I think Zelensky doesn't really have much room to negotiate. That I think he has rallied himself as a Winston Churchill type war leader, but I don't see how Zelensky can talk about negotiation. Just as I don't think Putin is really in a position to talk about negotiations, because he has bet his legacy on being a Russian czar, as it were, who has added territory to the Russian Federation, a la Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, or name your former autocrat. So I think that these positions are hardened. There's not a lot of wiggle room for either party, and that's why this is a war of attrition. And we'll just have to wait and see which side can actually field an army that potentially can win.
But no Russian Tsar has ever succeeded in cutting Russia off from Europe. And so that's my question to you. Is it conceivable, really, that Russia can remove itself from Europe in the way it seems to be trying to do and become a Chinese partner, an Asian country, or something else?
I'll return back to the Asian partner, but I think Putin has basically said that this is Russia's great war, and it will be the equivalent of World War II. So I think if he follows these actions, if he follows the rhetoric that he has not only talked about, but has actually implemented, I don't see how Russia becomes a European player, especially because Europe has changed. and Europe has all these institutions that Russia will not be a part of. So yes, I think historically Russia has been perceived as a part of Europe, but in light of all the institutions now that Putin has basically rejected, I don't see how Putin and Russia becomes a part of Europe anytime soon.
All right, we're going to continue with that. We have more questions. I don't know how much time we have, but we're going to continue. We have Hiroki Takeuchi. Would Russia had invaded Ukraine if Ukraine was a member of NATO? In other words, has NATO been working for the terrorists?
I think Putin decided all by himself that he was going to invade Ukraine. We will only, I don't try to read Vladimir Putin's mind as to why he thought now was the best time, other than the fact that I think he thought that he was really the only one who would deal with Ukraine, that Yeltsin and all the other post-Soviet leaders basically decided that Ukraine was going to go its own way. And Putin was never for that. He was never for the integration of Ukraine into the EU. He was always against the association agreement. He always has a zero-sum attitude towards trade agreements, that they could only favor Russia and can't really favor any other country. So I think Putin decided that it was long enough and that he was the only one who could deal what he saw as the Ukrainian problem.
Well, he goes at other questions from Christopher that might be connected. Christopher says, thank you. Greetings from Ukraine, Denmark history, 1987. Did you view this more than an issue of a Russian imperialism or ramifications for Ukraine to firmly decide to side with the Western values? Perhaps, perhaps Ukraine is paying the price for choosing freedom over allying with Russia. What do you think about that?
I think that's true for a large extent. I think Ukraine has insisted since, it voted for independence in 1991 at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Ukraine wanted to be a European country. And they have basically fought for that. That was what happened. That was the issue of the Orange Revolution. That was the issue of the Revolution of Dignity. And I think that Ukraine has always wanted, has since the end of the Soviet Union, has wanted to be European. And I think in the aftermath of this war and all the crimes that have been committed against Ukraine, that the issue of whether Ukraine is European or not will be decided. And I think at the end of this war, the term post-Soviet, in terms of defining Ukraine's position in the Eurasian space, I think that will change as well. I think the Ukrainians have basically decided that the term post-Soviet needs to be retired.
That's correct. We have another question. Let me see time. We're good. We have Matt T. Do you believe that Russia might perhaps be in a sunk cost situation where any outcome other than victory will be unacceptable to current leadership? If so, are peace talks even possible outside of the surrender of one side or the other?
Well, yes, I think that there is really no way out for Vladimir Putin. And I think Putin was looking over his shoulder just 2 years ago when he rewrote the Russian Constitution, because he demanded and put into the Constitution that ex-presidents would have immunity from prosecution and that they would be would have a lifetime membership in the Federation Council, which also brings immunity as well. So I think Putin was looking over his shoulder when he wrote that document. And I think that his greatest fear in many ways is that he will follow the path of Nazarbayev, the former president of Kazakhstan, who everyone thought was going to be president for life. And he put that in his constitution. And once the revolt against Nazarbayev began, he was gone in a few weeks.
Well, what about a no peace, no war sort of pre-Brest-Litovsk solution, you know,
I don't think that's
ceasefire?
I don't think that's acceptable for Ukraine. And I think Ukraine, no matter what, will require or demand reparations for the damage that has been done to Ukraine.
Well, they'll demand, but I mean,
They'll demand, but I will say that one of the great mistakes of Putin at the beginning of this war was that he didn't withdraw all of his assets from Western banks. And it's estimated that 300 billion, 350 billion, no one really knows the number, is still stuck in these Western banks. And I think Ukraine will try and maybe succeed to have those be the reparations for Ukraine. And I don't think, you know, no peace, I think just kind of saying, you know, the war will stop. I don't think Putin will stop in that case. I would think that Putin would see that as an opportunity to make more advances.
Thank you. All right, we have 3 more questions before we go. We have another question from Andrew Strickland. With Russia falling and might break up again, how do we keep nuclear weapons from falling into the wrong hands? If they break off, since Russia is weaker, these small republics would want to get their hands on these weapons. What do you think about that?
That will be a problem. I mean, that was a problem when the Soviet Union collapsed. That was the whole emphasis and understanding behind the Budapest Memorandum, that we didn't want another nuclear power, and that Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. But clearly, if the Russian Federation collapses, and this is a possibility now, we will have another problem, not just the question of where Putin has placed tactical nuclear weapons, but who is in control of the Russian nuclear weapons as well. So I see that as a huge problem. And, you know, I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't support Ukraine.
I see. All right. We're almost done. I know Jim wants to connect. Let me read this question from Dean Ryder. Do you think that Ukraine will be allied with the West long-term after the war with Russia is over, given its recent undemocratic actions like suspending certain political parties and seizing control of media outlets?
I think that Ukraine has tried to protect civil liberties during this war. Clearly, the Ukrainian past, there have been attempts to stifle free media and so forth. But I believe that Ukraine knows that its future rests with adhering to these institutions and values, and that for it to become a viable nation, it will have to live up to the EU principles and other principles going forward.
You've, may I interject, you've been to Ukraine many, many times, I know, Will. Can you comment on its evolution from 10 years ago, 20 years ago, toward a more developed, a more robust, a more rule of law state? I mean, how much has it really changed and evolved? My thought is that it has.
It has changed. There have been serious attempts to go after corruption. There has been a significant decentralization of power over the last 10 to 15 years. I think that Ukraine, although very imperfect, has again shown that its willingness to try to engage and to introduce these changes. And what was the last question, Dan?
Just how much has it evolved? You're answering it.
Mm-hmm. I think
law state.
I think Ukraine has evolved, and I think the consequences of Putin's war is that there's a much more unified Ukraine after this war. And indeed, what has Putin gone after? He's gone after Kharkiv. He's gone after Odessa, Mariupol. All these places were Russian-speaking cities. And so I don't see Russia being able to kind of return as a dominant.
I mean, we can't call it a Nazi state.
No,
Whatever happened there in World War II,
right?
which is
No,
a long time ago.
that will be a long time ago. I keep reading about, you know, the various Nazi, various types of Nazi influences on the Ukrainian nation during World War II. But I think that this war has shown that Ukraine has evolved, and I think that one of the consequences of this war is that from Russia's perspective, it will never be able to use World War II as the great unifying event for the greater post-Soviet space. Ukraine will never, you know, after being accused of genocide, after suffering all these assaults on housing and missiles and so forth, it will never accept the fact that the victory in World War II was a greater Soviet victory, as it were.
I mean, people have to understand that Azov battalion right-wing elements certainly exist, but this is not the dominant feature of this evolving state.
No, I agree.
Forces exist in Germany, or, you know, where the same process
and
has evolved over the decades.
right, and Zelensky has made sure during this war that Ukraine evolves as a multicultural state, as
Yes.
opposed to a bunch of ethnic enclaves scattered around the nation.
It's interesting to point out that Zelensky is Jewish, by the way,
Yes, and a Russian speaker.
and a Russian speaker. But I have a question for the two of you before we run out of time. What is this new Russian nationalism? I mean, is it something of a piece of what we have seen historically in Russia, going back to the Tsarist times? Does Putin have a new ideology here? I can't pronounce the term very well, but he wrote about, how do you say it, Dan? Novorossiya? This new Russia somehow. And how does this stack up with Ukrainian nationalism? Certainly now we see a Ukrainian nationalism. So, I mean, you've got a conflict here between two nationalisms. Are they the same? Are they old? Are they different?
Well, I
Go
mean,
ahead, Dan.
nationalism is a potent force, obviously, historically. And, you know, these nationalisms that you describe are not new, certainly not, and existed in the 1990s in Russia before Putin became a household name or leader of the government. And in Ukraine also, after Chernobyl, nationalism grew there. But, you know, it's been a force in Ukraine going back into Tsarist times, certainly. And no, it's not new. It's the term I've used is metastasized with Putin into something more blunt, more sharp-edged, more absolute, more extreme. But it's been there certainly for a long time.
And I'll just add that Putin basically proposed 2 months ago that universities need to teach a course on essentially the glories of Russian statehood. And his glories of Russian statehood essentially go back into deep roots into imperial Russian history. That somehow the state is overall in control, that there isn't possible for dissent, and that the Russian people should just basically insist that the notion of the state, as opposed to any sort of separation of powers or anything like that, is the way to hold this country together. And I think Putin's attempt to reanimate statehood as the primary ideology of Russia, as I said, goes back long into Russian history.
And I would add to that the state in this conception and throughout a lot of imperial Russian history is always equated with the empire. It's impossible to separate them. So the state is the empire, and the empire is the state, and the state, as Will has pointed out, is a larger sort of metaphysical entity in the minds of official Russia, and they try to pass that on to the people as well. So it's a very important concept.
And I'll add again that one of the leading Russian constitutional lawyers has emphasized the notion of statehood and empire in his new book on the history of state and law in Russia. And indeed, the driving force, he said, of empire is expansion.
Could I just follow up and ask you whether this new Russian nationalism, does it resonate with the Russian minority in Ukraine? How much support does Putin really have in Ukraine?
Well, I think that in light of his attacks on Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine, that his support, whatever it might have been before this war, has been greatly diminished. And I don't think the citizens of Kharkiv or Odessa or other citizens in different parts of the region have emphasized their Russianness after the end of this war. And indeed, they have fallen into what I said was Zelensky's great triumph of this war, and that it was creating a multicultural Ukraine. And that, I hope, will be what emerges in the new Ukraine after this war.
All right, thank you. We have just one more question I think we have from Hiroki, and I just would like to add, it's interesting how in a world that is expanding, that it's connecting, everyone is connecting, all the new generations are connecting. He wants to go to the center again, like control, just one person control of the government or the state control to everything. So we have our last question, Hiroki. Why did Germany have such an optimistic perspective for the consequences of relying on energy supply to Russia?
Well, that was a policy of many decades, going back to the Soviet Union. And I believe that the Germans thought that, it was a way to have a partnership. From the Russians' perspective, it was a great cash cow, as it were, and the Germans paid hard currency all the time. And why Putin decided that he could go it alone and didn't need that is baffling. Indeed, there was all this talk when she was in Moscow just the other week about, China kind of picking up the pace and importing more oil and gas. Yet the headline of Rossiyska Gazeta on the day that she left was not that it was a tremendous summit, but that there was no agreement on the strength of Siberia pipeline, and no contract was signed. And so therefore, that basically China is being able to get Russian energy at great discounts. And, Putin thought that, still thinks that this will be a new source of revenue for Russia, but it won't be the same as the Europeans.
And there's a historical reason, Hiroki, I think, going back to Versailles, Rapallo, the pact in 1939, technology transfers, energy transfers. Germany's always thought of itself as understanding Russia better than most and having more positive relations and being willing to bail out Russia historically and also for its own mutual benefit in the 20th century. So, I mean, it's not often well understood how closely those two countries have worked together diplomatically and economically in the 20th century. So I think that reliance on Russian gas and oil is part of that tradition.
All right. Thank you both. So we're going to the closing remarks. And Daniel, please, if you can start, and then William, and we can close this very informative controversy webinar we have today. Please, Daniel.
Well, as I was suggesting a little earlier, I'm still wondering how complete a break from Europe Russia can make. And I also wonder about what we could have done to have made it different, have had somewhat of a different outcome. And that troubles me. You know, I'd like to think that had we handled some things a little differently, it might have been better. And then, of course, it runs up against my sense that, you know, there's a very limited amount we could have done to have changed this trajectory of Russian nationalism growing out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think back to Gorbachev begging Bush to help me on Ukraine, you know, help me out here. I need Ukraine. Don't promote their independence. And that didn't work out, and the Soviet Union did collapse. I'm not in the school that believes that it collapsed because of Ukraine, as some scholars are arguing now. I think the Russian issue was much larger. So that's my final thought. I think Ukraine, one of the big fears of Putin in this ideological mode is that the West comes through Ukraine via Poland. That's a historical thing as well. Huge animosity and fear of Western ideology, religion, primarily in the past, coming in from Poland through Ukraine and somehow poisoning Russia in a way that Putin and other right-wing thinkers find unacceptable. And that's a hard one to tackle, but that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Will?
Well, for my closing remarks, I often wonder what we could have done differently or better. And there are certain things that we did pursue that some people would argue hurt the relationship between Russia and the United States and Russia and Europe. But I will end by talking about my experiences and my experiences as a lawyer in Moscow, in a law firm that had expats and a significant number of Russian lawyers as well. And I often go back to how that was just a unique opportunity and a unique situation where we were able to work as a team, as partners. The Russians and the expat lawyers worked well together. The Western law firms put a tremendous amount of effort and money to train these Russian lawyers. A lot of the lawyers that I worked with in Moscow, the Russian lawyers, had been able to get an LLM in tax in New York University and other major universities in the United States. And the tax practice was run by Russian lawyers, and they were excellent lawyers. And so I often go back to those few days when, you know, I thought that we might have changed and passed a corner of U.S.-Russian relations. that there were signs of improvement, sign of interaction, and I don't think anyone anticipated that it could all be rolled back all so fast. And the law firm that I used to work for is now, they basically, the US firm abandoned the law firm. It's now run by a couple Russian lawyers, but they're never going back. And all the other law firms and accounting firms are never going back until they think they can have, well, either A, make money, or B, really make a business. And so I am saddened, really, by the attempts to form and to not just integrate Russia, but to basically work with Russia to make a new Russia. And that has not taken place, obviously. But in Ukraine, I will add that there were other institutions and other law firms that also have built up Ukrainian practices. And I think the hope of Ukraine is with this next generation who have been exposed to the West, who have enjoyed or benefited from a Western education, Western internet, and so forth, and that Ukraine will emerge as a European nation.
Thank you, Will. Jim, sorry, you would like to add something before we go? We cannot hear you. Hold on. We cannot hear you yet.
Second. There we go.
Yeah.
Yes, I just want to thank my two colleagues for such an enlightening hour of discussion here about, what has become one of the tremendous flashpoints today in world politics. And, we just have to keep looking for a way out of this, I think. And I know the Europeans are doing everything they can to hopefully bring this to something of a successful conclusion. So thanks to all of you who have joined us today, and to Astrid for putting this together and ably moderating the questions, to Dan, my great friend and colleague, and to Will, my colleague at the Wilson Center. Thank you both. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do not forget to connect through our social media and SMU.edu Tower Center. And if you would like to know more about our panelists today, Will at Wilson Center, William at the Wilson Center, and our own professor here, Danielle, you can find it in SMU also website. Thank you very much, and have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.